Working Cows Podcast, episode 309. This episode is brought to you by Farming Without the Bank.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. And this episode is brought to you by Farming Without the Bank. None of you are farming like you did 100 years ago. Why are you financing it like you did 100 years ago? The biggest part of your operation is the money that runs through your hands, and you let someone else control that. The bank gets the final say in what you get money for and when you pay it back. For many, this is a great relationship, until it's not. Farming Without the Bank shows you how to take back control of your money so you can make the bank plan B instead of plan A. This is done by creating your own banking system that you own and control. To learn more, tune into the Farming Without the Bank podcast and go to thefarmingwithoutthebank.com to get the book. Once you've read the book, Mary Jo will meet with you one-on-one to help you determine where and how to get started. She will most likely also touch on some estate transition ideas, financing ideas, business growth or startup ideas, and many other things that she has experience with from helping thousands of farmers and ranchers like you. Again, go to farmingwithoutthebank.com to get the book and subscribe to the Farming Without the Bank podcast today. Very excited to be joined today by Natalie Kovarik and Tara Vander Dussen. Welcoming Natalie back again. Talked to her and her husband Luke previously, and welcoming Tara to the podcast for the first time. She has been on other podcasts you may have listened to. She's been on with Jason Meadows on the Ag State of Mind podcast, and among others. But they have also started a new podcast, and that's going to kind of help us facilitate the conversation that we want to have today around a more healthy conversation within agriculture and a more healthy conversation with those outside of agriculture. So, Natalie, Tara, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back. I was on a couple of years ago with my husband, Luke, but I honestly have no idea what we talked about. So it kind of feels like my first time back on.
If I remember right, we talked about technology and agriculture, and we talked a little bit about social media and those kinds of things. But yeah, I'm there. Like I told you before we started, today I learned that you're a pharmacist. So we're reintroducing ourselves again. But yeah, so I appreciate what you guys have been doing with Discover Ag over the last couple of years. I don't know the timeline exactly, but really appreciate what you guys have been doing, and would love to hear a little bit more about that, because I think it sets us up for the conversation that we're intending to have today. So.
Yeah. So kind of kicking off with our podcast, if you're listening to this, obviously you're podcast people, our kind of people. We love podcasting. And so Natalie and I have a podcast called Discover Ag, and we started the original podcast back in April of 2022, but we went kind of under a massive rebrand at the beginning of the year. And that is the podcast that we have now, Discover Ag. And what we do on that podcast is we cover the top 3 trending news articles in the ag and food space. So just, we have lots of listeners that send in suggestions. We kind of scope out what's happening on Twitter and social media, like what are people talking about, and then pick the 3 top trending ones and cover them on our podcast, and kind of give a lot of times these are from the New York Post or New York Times, or just really big publications that you can think of, and a lot of times they just miss a lot of the detail and nuanced conversation around agriculture. So we kind of bring our professional farming and ranching opinions and expertise to the conversation and kind of break down those topics.
Yeah, and Tara, you are an environmental scientist, which I think is a big part of what the conversation that we're having right now in agriculture, within agriculture, and then also the looking at us from the outside. I mean, John Kerry recently said we're not going to get where we want to go with our climate goals without agriculture's participation, and some of those things. And that's probably the most generous framing of what he said.
Yeah, I was about to say, wow, that was very politically correct. What you sub-phrasing that.
We actually covered that on the podcast, and I think we did not put it that way, Clay.
Yeah, we were not that nice.
Yeah. Well, I've heard it said, if you're not at the table for the conversation, you're going to be on the menu. Basically, I think that was maybe Zippy Duvall who might have said that first, and he's the president of American Farm Bureau at this point, anyways. And so, I think that's true. We have to be able to provide answers for the culture. I think a big part of agriculture going forward is going to be maintaining social license to continue operating, and so answering those questions. So I guess kind of that's where I'd like to start the conversation in earnest, is what are we doing to maintain that social license and continue to answer those questions from the world outside that is becoming more and more disconnected from agriculture.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. I actually had my husband guest appearance on the podcast because Tara was in Rome for doing UN work for dairy. And we covered an article about, I don't know if you heard about it, but it was a girl's 4-H goat in California, I think. And at the end of it, they did not want to give it up for the meat. And so they stole the goat, and then the police are after. And it was this whole thing about, 4-H and animal and, how we're treating and raising our youth to I guess, view animals maybe. And so my husband and I were kind of delving into that welfare conversation and urban, thoughts on animals versus rural thoughts on animals. And he brought up a really good point, I think, which is exactly what you said, that, I think we are making headway. I think social media has helped with it. Just connecting people back again that are, removed from food. But I think we're pretty naive if we think we'll ever have to stop. That's what happens when we have a society set up that is removed from how their food is produced. There's always going to be room for questions and concerns and just honestly misinformation. Like when you are removed from how something is created, that's how all the emotion gets brought into it. So I think we have to continue to forge those relationships with our counterparts that aren't, out on the farm and ranch every single day like we are.
Clay, you started this conversation with saying like the Zippy Duvall quote that if you're not at the table, you're on the table. And I actually heard when I was at the UN, as Natalie mentioned last month, I heard that phrase different. If you're not at the table, you're not on the menu. Like you won't be put on the menu in all of these conversations around what we're feeding people. And it actually brings up an even like better point, like of how our society is currently like approaching things. It is like an all or nothing. Like, it is like, oh, okay, so cattle have, produce methane. Let's just completely remove cattle. And there's no other conversation there. It's like, just so extreme, it seems like. And so making sure that we are a part of these conversations and that we do have that social currency is going to be crucial for us to continue to be on the menu.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that a lot of times what gets lost in this conversation is the responsibility of the urban neighbors as well. Like, you want to talk about nitrogen use in conventional agriculture, if you want to use that term. Well, let's talk about like nitrogen use on golf courses, and let's talk about nitrogen use on lawns, and the fact that there isn't really a bottom line consideration on the lawn, especially. It's just whatever makes it green and grow and look good. We're going to use that much, and whether or not it's more than it needed or not. And so I think that those are some of the things that get lost in these conversations too, about there's more to the conversation than just what agriculture is doing in these situations.
Yeah, one of my favorite stats is that there's more water use on lawns and golf courses than on any other like quote unquote crop or in acres. And I think that's the thing too, is like I don't want it to be like a pointing fingers at each other. It's more that like we just all can address that we all have an impact on water use, nitrogen use, emissions, like everybody are contributing to things. And so instead of being like it's animal ag's fault, like let's get rid of it. It's like, how can we actually make our entire system work better, work more efficiently, be more sustainable as a whole?
Yep. And Natalie, did you have something to say there too?
kind of, on the same vein of like pointing fingers, it's hard. And I feel like that's kind of what we lean towards in society. We covered on the podcast a couple of months ago the trending article and topic that was, I don't know if you heard about Saudi Arabia down in Arizona, that, alfalfa farm that was coming under major heat for water usage and, the whole shebang down there. But one of our points was, you're naive if you think that probably isn't Phoenix's concern because they want it, for urban water rights. And then there's, also the due diligence to understand that sometimes it doesn't matter how much water you put on the crop, it's how much you're actually yielding from it, right? And so those are, again, just really nuanced conversations that you're right. Us as an agriculture needs to have the responsibility to partake in and create conversation around, and our counterparts have to, do due diligence to come to open to the conversation and, hear what we're saying and like do investigation and research on their own.
And I think that you two ladies have a unique perspective on this, given your work in advocacy. I'm sorry if that's a terrible term, but that's the one that comes to my mind. And do you think then that there is good faith on the whole, and that if it bleeds, it leads is why we hear about the bad faith arguments coming to us from the other side? Or is there genuinely a majority of the other side of the conversation, if I could say it that way, that is bringing a bad faith argument?
I think it's probably a combination. I do think we typically hear about the bad things in our news and media more often, right? And I think like a lot of times the loudest voice in the room is not the majority. Like the majority of people probably don't think like cattle are, totally killing the planet, even though that's what we see in the media, or I would like to think so. And I think one thing with Discover Ag, it's really like, it's been interesting to see what people send into us. Like, what are their questions? And honestly, I think that from Ag, we also have to remember to approach these conversations of like, sometimes I think in Ag, we'll approach them as like, oh, that's a dumb question, or that's a dumb comment. There's these people just don't know, and what they don't know, and that's not at any fault of theirs. And so I think we, being the good neighbors, have to come at it from just a very open and honest, transparent, like look at agriculture to answer their questions. And like take into account that just because you've seen a headline that like was terrible about animal ag, it doesn't mean this person on the internet or whatever that's not necessarily where they're coming at it from. That's just what you're saying. We all have these biases and all the things that are influencing, how we approach things. And so just trying to be like, I think, open and willing to have the conversation is probably the most important, like, first step.
Yeah, definitely. I think that so much of it, I mean, I don't know what it is in our world today, but everything's polarized. Everything has two sides, and tends to be the only ones that get any airtime are the ones on the very far extremes of the two conversations. And so I think that is part of it, but that we continually have to be adding a more reasoned voice to those conversations so that those two polar opposites don't continue to drive the narrative.
Yeah, I think that's always been one of my goals with Discover Ag, is not necessarily, actually it is not to get people to think the exact same way I do. It's to put out information that they can make an informed decision on their own. And I think that's what's really important. And I think honestly, that's what's lacking, is I think people are trying to make good decisions. Sometimes the material and information they have at their fingertips to make those decisions just isn't the right information or good information. And so I think our job, niched on Discover Ag and, macro as a whole industry, isn't necessarily to get people to think the way we do and conform them. It's just to like put out the information so they can make the decision on their own.
You guys also, I was just made aware or came across the fact that you guys are also working on a docuseries. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is that a fairly new thing?
Yeah, we have been working behind the scenes on a docuseries. It is fairly new. We recorded the pilot episode in September of last year and got kind of the editing back at the beginning of this year. And then we have behind the scenes been working actually on our second episode that we'll be filming next month in Montana. And, our goal for it is to really like pair with the podcast that you can listen and learn about ag, but also like a visual component. And our goal is to go out to different types of farms, ranches, and learn about things we don't know about. So our first episode was about cotton, and neither of us knew anything about cotton. And so kind of approach it almost as like a consumer side of like not being knowledgeable. Like, yes, we have the background in ag, but just because you're in ag doesn't mean you know everything about all the different types of ag. And so kind of getting to ask those like quote unquote dumb questions and hear what, the farmers have to say, and just bring people along on like the journey of like the beauty of agriculture and what's really cool and the people behind agriculture, and connect, the consumers with those people that are not only feeding us, but clothing us, like food, fuel, fiber kind of things.
You mentioned at the beginning of this that my background is in pharmacy. And one thing that always astounded me when I was a pharmacist on the other side of the counter is, someone would come in, and for as important as our health is to us as individuals, our bodies, happiness, how we live our life, quality of life. I do feel like we're very nonchalant about our health, right? I would hand a new prescription to someone and ask if they had questions, and they'd say no, and they'd be, off on their merry way. And I kind of feel like it's the same thing when it comes to food. As important as food is to our everyday lives, and even beyond that, agriculture, if you're in agriculture listening to this, that we go far beyond just providing food for society. It blows my mind that for something that is so integrated and important for everyday life, people just don't care much about it or have two thoughts about it. And so honestly, we just really want to make like ag relatable again. We want to make it cool and fun again, and just get people like reinterested and reconnected, and like honestly craving that connection to their food.
And I think that we're all in progress, right? Or process. We're all in process, right? And that agriculture has been adopting different practices over the last 30, 40 years, and has been paying attention to resource concerns over that same period of time. And so I think that we can talk a little bit about some of the progress that has been made along those lines, right? I mean, there has been reduced resources needed to produce the same amount of, whatever it is, food, fiber, those kinds of things. I mean, and I think that that's part of this conversation too, is that we're making progress, but then we hope that other people are also aware of that progress, but also looking at their own resource uses and saying, we can make progress too. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that we are making progress. It's kind of like twofold, there's two ways to look at it. Like, are things like, I think a lot of people approach agriculture as like things are bad and like getting worse. And like, if you're in ag, that's not true, that things are good and getting better. I think people wish we were like getting better faster, but things take time. I mean, when you work in seasons, like in farming, ranching, cattle, where, it takes you 2 years to raise a dairy cow up, like it's not something you can just flip a switch and make a change and do things. But there has been such great progress. And, it's one of those things, we talked about this on Discover Ag a couple of weeks ago too, about like the, emissions conversation. We are doing more with less, but we have to take into account the fact that we have to produce more food now than we ever have. And that's not stopping yet. Like we're seeing that maybe by 2050, the tides will turn and we'll be producing less. But right now, like, we're expected to do more with less and feed more people also. Like, you have to consider, like the absolute emissions versus like emissions intensity. Like, you can have less emissions per gallon of milk, but if you need to produce 3 times as many gallons of milk because you have 3 times as many people, that's going to have an impact on your emissions.
Yeah, very true. Tara, what was your experience at the UN like? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've actually gone twice. The first time was in 2019, and I gave a presentation on a panel. And this time I was there for gender negotiations and agri-food systems. So just, a very basic level of like women being allowed to own land and livestock, being able to apply for loans. So, just some things we probably very much take for granted in this country. And I think both times there's been a few like highlights. And one of them is that in lots of places in the world, the people producing food, the agriculture, farmers, ranchers, are the people that are most food insecure, which is really disheartening. They are the people that, if you're producing food, you're going to be selling that food in order to make an income. And then you may ultimately not actually have enough food to feed your family. And so just like the ramifications of that have been very like impactful. And also like the need to, here in the United States, we do a really great job of producing like things like meat and milk. We're very efficient at it. We're amazing at it. How can we take that technology, what we've learned, and take it to other developing nations? And that's where I think there's the real benefit actually of reducing emissions. If we can have other countries like that are in developing nations do the same thing we're doing, where they have lower emissions, that could have such a positive impact on, global agriculture emissions. Like it's just wild when you really get into the country numbers. You have India, who doesn't even consume meat, and they're the largest emitter of cattle methane in the world, and then it just, that's like an extreme end of the scale. And then, you have the United States that has a really great beef supply system as far as efficiency and emissions go, and then everything in between. And it's like, how do we help pull people along so that we can reduce overall global numbers?
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Farming Without the Bank. None of you are farming like you did 100 years ago. Why are you financing it like you did 100 years ago? The biggest part of your operation is the money that runs through your hands, and you let someone else control that. The bank gets the final say in what you get money for and when you pay it back. For many, this is a great relationship, until it's not. Farming Without the Bank shows you how to take back control of your money so you can make the bank plan B instead of plan A. This is done by creating your own banking system that you own and control. To learn more, tune into the Farming Without the Bank podcast and go to thefarmingwithoutthebank.com to get the book. Once you've read the book, Mary Jo will meet with you one-on-one to help you determine where and how to get started. She will most likely also touch on some estate transition ideas, financing ideas, business growth or startup ideas, and many other things that she has experience with from helping thousands of farmers and ranchers like you. Again, go to farmingwithoutthebank.com to get the book and subscribe to the Farming Without the Bank podcast today. Let's talk a little bit about the, as I said, the regenerative agriculture side of things. And I think that sometimes, or a lot of times, maybe often, that it ends up being us versus them again, and ag versus ag, which is unfortunate. And I end up with my feet in both of those conversations. I sit on the board of South Dakota Farm Bureau, and then I also run in this space where most of the listeners would probably classify themselves as regenerative agriculture producers. And so I am personally, all about the individual's right to farm as they see best and ranch as they see best. And so I think that's where I kind of start in this conversation. But I think that there's a lot of people out there that have hitched their wagons to different leaders in their respective spaces, and they're going in opposite directions, except for when they are facing each other to shoot at each other. And so I guess what's your guys' perspective on that conversation? How are you interfacing with that conversation? What have been some of your experiences?
Yeah, the conversation we're all, tiptoeing into or tiptoeing around. I'm starting to find, the more I spend time, discussing articles on Discover Ag and having these conversations, the more I'm really starting to hate labels. Like, I really think that that's part of the problem. And we spend a lot of time talking about food labels. But I think it carries over into something like this, like labeling ourselves as, producers. I was asking Tara the other day, just offhand, in a conversation, not on the podcast or anything, but I was like, who are the people that call themselves the regenerative rancher? Because I was like, me and my husband don't. I would never say, I'm quote unquote a regenerative rancher. But if we were to write down everything we do on our operation, it certainly falls under regenerative practices. We have been doing cover crops forever. We rotationally graze. We have a butterfly habitat. The list could go on of the things that we do. We work really closely with our local NRCS in our opinion, do a really good job of these regenerative, quote unquote, regenerative, quote unquote, sustainable practices. But I wouldn't label myself that. And that is, again, no offense to the person that does label themselves. I wish there was more, awareness around the idea that agriculture is a spectrum, and especially for people outside of the industry. And I think that's my real big hiccup with labeling ourselves conventional or regenerative and putting ourselves into very clean boxes for agriculture, because I'm really starting to fear that the consumer thinks it's either or, it's black and white, that there is no spectrum. For example, I use Will Harris a lot. I love what Will Harris is doing on his ranch. I think he has it dialed in for, where he's at in Georgia, for what his goals are, for the amount of, animals he has on his land, the amount of acres he owns. Like, he really has it dialed in. He's doing a phenomenal job. What I fear is that a consumer looks at Will Harris and then looks at me and says, you're not regenerative because you're not doing exactly what Will Harris is doing. That is what regenerative is. And they don't understand that soil types are different, rainfall types are different, animal breeds are different. I mean, there's so many variables that go into it. And then you start getting into a Texas producer and a Colorado producer and a New York ranch and all these different things. And I'm really afraid that us in agriculture are doing ourselves a disservice by saying, quote unquote, regenerative or quote unquote conventional, because I think it does the most disservice actually to the consumer and how they view us.
Again, I think it's part of that progress that we were talking about earlier, that there have been steps made in the direction of reducing, reducing tillage, reducing emissions, all those things. And, I've even had really staunch regenerative guys say, sometimes tillage is the answer. Sometimes that is the way that we have to deal with these issues. So, I mean, it's never just one thing. And I think that it's, back to the whole conversation we were having earlier, it's all part of the same symptom that we're facing, same issues that we're facing in this country of just totally fractured and polarized conversations. And there seems to be a lack of ability to have a healthy conversation around these things. And so I appreciate what you had to say there about it being a spectrum, and definitely that there's always room for everyone to grow and to mature in these conversations and in the way that they're handling their resources. And I think as long as people remain open-minded and willing to look at a better way of doing something, I don't think that you can fault them for what they are doing. I think that they're on a path towards something different, something better. And as long as they're willing to change, then we can work with them and say, well, let's look at this opportunity that is presenting itself to us as far as how we handle the resources that have been entrusted to us.
Yeah, and I think it's also crazy to think that we're going to feed 330 million people here just in the United States all exactly the same way. Like, I think people have different priorities in their life and different concerns. Like, for someone that is looking for affordability, that grassed finished steak is maybe not going to be their option. It's going to be grocery store conventional, whatever they are able to afford. And so when ag kind of attacks each other, I think it just gives us all a black eye. I would hate for someone who could not afford a certain cut of meat to feel less than for purchasing a cheaper cut of meat. I think overall, we could all agree, as no matter where you fall in this regenerative conversation, that person purchasing a steak is better than them not purchasing a steak. And so when we fight, it makes consumers lose confidence in the entire system. They don't lose confidence in just a certain little piece. They lose confidence in our entire food system, and that hurts all of us.
Would you agree then that part of the solution is for the people who don't have the polarized view to engage in the conversation?
Yeah, I think both Natalie and I are pretty strong in our belief of communicating. And so I do think that, we have a portion of our business called Elevate Ag, where we help farmers, ranchers, producers share their story online, because we believe so strongly that lots of people sharing online is better than only a few people sharing online, because it opens up different ideas. Natalie said, I don't ever want to necessarily change someone's opinion on what they buy at the grocery store. I just want them to feel confident and have the knowledge to make the decision they want to make. And the only way we do that is by having lots of different people sharing and but at the same time, I think you can share about your type of agriculture without bashing another type of agriculture. I think there's a fine line there. As being in the milk space, there can be a lot of times where, there's conversations around bashing plant-based milk. And my point is always, food choice is fine with me. If you want to choose plant-based milk, that's great. But let's have the conversation about it. It doesn't mean it's healthier. It doesn't mean it's more sustainable. Those are different conversations. You can choose to buy whatever product you want, but having the knowledge and understanding of how it's produced can help you make that decision.
This is kind of a corny saying too, but like the don't hate the player, hate the game. I think that's really what we're falling into. And right now we're kind of hating the players, like regenerative versus conventional or organic versus, whatever it is. But we've had conversations with direct to consumer beef businesses before where they're like, I necessarily know I don't need to put no antibiotics on my beef, and I don't need to label it that way. I don't need to say some of these terms I'm saying. But if I don't, I am the only direct-to-consumer beef business that doesn't have that on the labeling. And so now consumers look at us and think, oh gosh, they're the outlier. They're the ones that has antibiotics. And so I think it is, again, that not the players, it's the game. It's this game we're in where labels have turned to marketing ploy. And they started out great, great food labels had good intentions, but I think they've really gone off track and they're to sell a product, and they've really gotten away from like the core mission, I think, of helping consumers actually understand something, and instead are just to get something to be bought.
Yeah. And I think that, again, it tends to be that the algorithms seem to reward the people with the most polarized take on both sides. And so I think that what we should do, what we need to do, is to continue to elevate, like you said, those voices that are bringing a different side to that conversation, not shooting at either side, but saying this is what we're doing and this is how we are taking care of land, animals, money, people. This is how we are caring for these resources that have been entrusted to us, because I think that it's not going to lead in a healthy direction. And I can't remember if it got said while we were talking or not. I've had some difficulties on my end, so I had a little hiccup there. But that if you think that you are not going to be next in line, anybody in animal agriculture, no matter how you are caring for this, I think it's pretty naive. I think Tara, you opened up by saying that as well. And I think that is something that we should recognize, that it's going to be, it's not going to stop with a certain style of management. It's going to continue, and we all have to point in the same direction and communicate and say, these are the good stories. These are the good things that we are all doing to continue to be able to have the next generation have something to work with, and a better resource than we found it. We're going to pass on to them.
And I'll keep us on this train of controversial things in agriculture because you said something that kind of triggered a story for me, or an example that I think is an interesting case study to kind of explore. But you said, the most polarizing or the loudest gets attention or reward. And there was a trend I noticed on social media recently with the mRNA vaccines. There was a direct-to-consumer beef account that kind of made a reel, short form content video for people who aren't, up and coming with the social media lingo. It's just a short video. That was basically saying, we are anti-mRNA. We are not going to be using this vaccine. It will not be in our beef, yada, 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 whatever that the, 10, 15, 30-second reel said. Went viral. Obviously, everyone who's removed from agriculture is fearful of things like that. You say something like mRNA in your food system and immediately outcry. So to see a direct consumer beef business that addressed that head on and said they didn't have it in there, which, as we know, is not used in beef at all, right? So that beef company didn't need to come out and say that anyway. Went viral. So then what I noticed was all of these littler direct to consumer beef businesses who are on social media started kind of doing the same thing. They were making reels saying, we're not using mRNA, it's not in our beef, never will, yada, 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 because they too wanted to get the attention, which I get. You want, the increased business. You're on social media for a marketing tool. It's to sell your product. I recently posted a video. It was actually to showcase our shoot. So it had nothing to do with like what we were doing on the ranch or that we were using vaccines or anything like that. But we were happening to vaccinate cattle at the time when I was showcasing the shoot. And I had comments that we're not even direct to consumer anyway, but someone commented, I would never buy beef from you guys. And so I just commented back and said, why? And she said, because you use vaccines. And those are the examples that I think we need to be really, really careful about as an industry, because if we start, taking stances on things and as an industry saying we'll never use them, that sways how a consumer looks at it. And I'm really afraid that we're going to go where a consumer says, I don't want mRNA vaccine in my beef, to I don't want vaccines used at all when it comes to our animal proteins. And I think we could all agree, no matter where you fall on the spectrum of agriculture, that the idea of raising animals without having a, pretty staunch vaccination protocol, like we're pretty proud and we implement that pretty aggressively on our operation, would be pretty detrimental. It'd be pretty hard to raise animals. So I think we need to be really, really careful about some of these conversations, because again, it really sways how these consumers view, and then at the end of the day, vote, with their dollar for agriculture.
That whole conversation has always been a little bit weird to me, because it seems like some of the same people that say I don't want vaccines in my beef are also the ones that saying everybody should be vaccinated with all the latest, and I don't get that conversation sometimes.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, a lot of times a lot of those people are, want really great animal welfare, and really great animal welfare a lot of times means having a really great vaccination protocol so that you don't have disease transmitted and that you have cows that are being prevented from ever getting sick. And it goes to the not knowing really like the ins and outs. And what's crazy is you would think that would convey more because, people get sick and we have vaccines and all these things too. But I think in the animal ag world, it gets even more lost and, convoluted into these micro conversations. But I agree with Natalie. We've definitely, as we've been on podcasts outside of the ag space, it's a question we've been getting more and more is about vaccines in cattle. And you could replace that with, anything else. Every time that like consumers are confused about something, as you guys both mentioned, like they're voting with their dollar. And when they vote against a technology in ag, like we lose that tool from our toolbox. Like we as dairy farmers, cattle ranchers, whatever, are no longer able to use whatever tool it is if consumers won't buy it and understand it at the grocery store. And so we just have to think like, we talk about technology in ag. There's so many exciting things happening. And if we can't get consumers to understand what we're doing and why we're doing them, how many future technologies will we lose out on because of their lack of understanding?
So what are some best practices for sharing online? I mean, I think you guys have both, developed a following and developed platforms from which you can share online. What have been some of the best practices that you have seen work? And then how can other people implement those so that they can do what we've been saying, share their story positively and add their voice, a balanced voice to the conversation rather than a polarized voice?
I would say put blinders on and have really good self-awareness around what your strengths are and what your mission is, because that is how you are going to best effectively share your story. So maybe you see someone popping off on YouTube, but if you hate talking into the video, for long form, or you're not very good at handling a camera and visual components and making it, a story for people to watch, it's not going to go well for you. So I think you need to have the self-awareness for like, what am I good at? Is it talking? Is it writing? Is it humor? Is it serious? Is it in depth? Is it light? What are your skills? And then pick the platform that is best suited for that, that you enjoy spending time on, and stop paying attention to whatever, someone else is doing and how they're doing it. Because, it is a job to share online. So the more suited you are for what you're doing, the better you are at it, the more fun it is, the more success you're going to have at it.
I've always resisted adopting the newest social media platform because I'm not good at the ones that I do use. And so I don't need to add something else that I'm doing poorly to the list.
Yeah, that's one thing we talk about is also you don't have to be everywhere. Like you can pick one platform that you really, really love and just do it so well. And then once you kind of get your footing there, like if there's something else you want to add, then that's great. But you don't have to feel like you have to be posting on 45 different social media sites in order to, have an impact on just one.
Natalie, you said put your blinders on. Is that about maintaining focus?
Yeah. And just like comparison or thinking you need to show up one way, versus another, or share about something because someone else, I think it's really important to just kind of stay in your own lane. I mean, I open up the app and I honestly don't even scroll or consume it very much. Like if you are, I guess, truly very passionate and if, trying to make a business, you're at that level of content creation, it's, better to be creating than it is to be consuming. So I guess kind of a little bit of that.
Sure. Yeah, I generally try to capture some bonus content after every episode that I do. And one of them, I was talking to somebody who is world renowned, and I, asked her about the imposter syndrome. She's like, yeah, I struggle with the imposter syndrome every day. It's like somebody who has a platform and not just a platform, but like the bona fides to back it up is telling me that. And so I think that that's probably something that people should recognize. You're going to deal with that, and don't let it stop you from sharing.
Yeah, we're all much more human than we'd like to think.
I always figured that people who had made it didn't have that issue, but I guess they do too. So, Tara, do you have anything to add as far as sharing online?
No, yeah, I'll add a little bit to that imposter syndrome. I do remember the first time when I got asked to speak at the UN, like I was like ready to say no. And just having this conversation, like it's a good reminder that like if you're being asked or if you're being called to share online or you're growing and it's bringing you opportunities, like they know what your credentials are, like they've seen what you're sharing online or whatever. And it means you are qualified. And like, why aren't you qualified to be able to share about your sector of agriculture and like your niche, whatever that is? And it's also the reminder to like, I hate this word because it's so like buzzwordy, but like being authentic, like just being who you are online is almost always going to be your social advantage. Like what makes you unique. I feel like the more I share online, the more I realize like also what makes me unique is not that unique. Like I'll be like, oh, I'm probably the only person that does this. And I'll have like 45 DMs that are like, I do the exact same thing. And so, like know that you are the person to be sharing that story and that like your story is worth telling.
Yeah, I think that that's one thing that I've told lots of people who've reached out to me about starting podcasts is I said first thing you need to do is be focused in who you are trying to reach with your podcast is know who your target audience is and really focus on them very like a laser bullseye target focus on them. But then the other thing is you might get done figuring out who your target audience is and realize, well, there's already a podcast that's marketing to them or that's targeted at them. But that podcast doesn't have your voice and your unique set of circumstances and ways of phrasing things and experiences. And so there's still room, there's still room. And who's to say that podcast won't pod fade, and go away. And then there you are ready to also have your voice already there in the conversation. So I think that there's always room for more voices in these conversations. And I think that's what we should always keep in mind when we think about whether or not it's a good idea for us to start. Do you ladies have anything personally that you want to promote? I know we've talked a little bit about Discover Ag today and what you guys are doing there and some of the exciting projects that you're working on, but do you have anything personally that you would like to share or promote before I let you go?
No, I think, one of our big focuses and honestly what's bringing us kind of the most excitement right now is our podcast. And since everyone listening is podcast people, we would love it if you would hop over and join us there. We're obviously very biased, but we think we have a lot of fun and we do a good job. So every Thursday you can find us Discover Ag, and we're funneling all of our energy and time and into that. So hopefully you guys can see the rewards of us doing that.
Very good. Well, Natalie, you're totally welcome to talk about the bull if you want to, but
I reached out, you guys, for everyone listening, I reached out to Clay and asked if we could promote a bull that we're in partnership with in his ad space. And Clay said that he was all booked out for ads for the year, which I'm like, congratulations, Clay, on your podcast. But he's like, if it happens to casually come up in conversation, I'm sure we could talk about it in your interview. And I guess this is the casually that happens to come up. But my husband and I, we ranch in Ord, Nebraska. And we are, fifth, sixth year into seed stock operation. We have a registered Angus, Black Angus. And we recently went into partnership on the top selling bull out of the Linscoff Thiel sale, the 2022 sale. It is LT Chieftain. We're in partnership with Frederickson Ranch out of Spearfish, and then obviously Brent Thiel out of Isabel. South Dakota. And so my husband is very excited about this bull. We're going to be actually getting our first calf crop from him in a few weeks. And if you are a producer in the seed stock business, you know how that exciting that is when you are really into genetics. And so, we're very excited about him. And if anyone is interested in semen from him, please contact my husband, Luke, Nate Fredrickson, or Brent Thiel.
Yeah, lots of connections here. I grew up with the Thiel, Brent's nephews, actually, and then I've been to Nate's sale there in Spearfish many times, and the connection here through the podcast. So really appreciate that. Appreciate you sharing that as well. Very good.
I feel like you guys are talking a different language, and I'm just like sitting over here listening. Like, I'm like, can I get a translator? Can someone translate that for me?
So Ord is on the east edge of the Sandhills. Is that right?
Yeah, we're right on the border. Yep.
Right.
So our summer pasture is definitely like Sandhills. We have the sandy ground that would be considered Sandhills, but kind of like our home base, which isn't, that far. Crow flies. I wouldn't say we have like that sandy soil texture.
Very good. All right. Well, ladies, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
for having us on.
Very good stuff there. Really appreciate them taking the time. Really appreciate their podcast. One of the better sound quality podcasts that I've listened to recently, honestly, especially when you consider the fact that they are recording remotely. The two of them sound very good on their podcast. I really appreciate them taking the time to sit down with me, answer some of my questions, and put up with some of my technical difficulties and my extremely skilled and subtle transitions into some shameless plugs. So really appreciate them and their time today. Looking forward to next week on the Working Cows podcast. I'm going to talk to Wally Congdon. And Wally is from Western Montana and has been really involved in the interface between public lands and agriculture and recreation and all of those things, and keeping all of those stakeholder relationships working. And so really, he's just a really knowledgeable guy and with a really unique perspective. He's a county attorney as well as a rancher, and he's just got a unique perspective and a lot of unique experience to share about how do we keep public lands open for public use and for specifically grazing, livestock, and agriculture. So really looking forward to sharing that conversation with you coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.